Thank you very much. Is the mic working? Yeah. Yeah, today I will be presenting a little bit about our project that we ran in Austin. We did a feedback survey there in 2020. And we saw in the middle of that survey, we saw a huge shift in responses. And we were really wondering, like, what is going on here? And it was not just a shift in like the number of responses, but we saw also a shift in like this swing of opinions. So what we're looking at in this presentation is whether there was actually a change of opinion in people or whether there was a differential turnout. And I will be thinking a little bit about like how can we use opinion clusters to look a little bit in a different way at multidimensional opinion data. So we did, in 2020, in May, June 2020, we did a feedback exercise together with the budget office of the city of Austin. And they really wanted to look at two different questions. So as they were facing some potential budget shortfalls as we were drafting this survey, the city was wondering, like, if they have to increase revenue in some way, like which of the categories of revenue that they have control over, people would support the most to increase the revenue from. And the second question was like, if they would have to redistribute the budget between departments, like what kind of preferences would people have? Because that can give you some insights in like where the priorities of the population lie. Already well before 2020, there was a clear indication in Austin that the police budget is always going to be a divisive issue. So that was very clear from the start, but we were trying to set up like a broader survey that was not just going into this binary question. So we came up with a feedback exercise that had 3 different sections, one really going into the revenue, one going into the expenditures, and one really going into the demographics. So here you see like 2 quick views of like what those sections look like. We built our own platform, and in the revenue section, we really asked people for each of the categories of revenue that the city could control. As you can see with these little locks, most of a good chunk of the budget they actually don't have control over at all. They just get the money, but they cannot control how much they get. But the parts that they do get from, which is most of that little slice, the user fees, they were asking the people, like, how much would you support if we increase those fees a little bit? And the second is we were asking people to redistribute the funds between the different departments that they were spending money on. And people had to be constrained in that a little bit. So they were not allowed to reduce any of the departments with more than 5% of the budget. And they had to make it a zero-sum exercise. So they really couldn't, like every time that they would add money to one department, they would have to take it away from another department to really make that, that exercise more realistic with regards to what the city council had to decide. As you may recall, it's been a while, but 2020 was a tumultuous year. We had not only a pandemic going on, but we had a whole lot of tumult, especially in the United States, with regards to Black Lives Matter, because there was a lot of violence going on in the communities. On May 25th, especially, George Floyd was killed, which was right in the middle of our survey. And that caused a lot of protests across the country, as well as in Austin. So what you can see in this graph, which is like a logarithmic scale on the vertical axis, is that there was a 100-fold increase right in the middle of that survey, which was a few days after the killing of George Floyd. And in line with economic literature, we will call it an exogenous shock, because it's really not just the murder, but it's really like the broader spectrum of events that really happened in those few days. And to be clear of like what the data is that we will be talking about, so we have the 2020 survey, which happened in that period of time, which we got 37,000 responses, which was way more than anyone expected when we were organizing the survey. We repeated the survey in a slightly altered version in 2021, which we got like a more normal response rate of like 1,500 responses. And then because we saw all these effects in 2020, we did a follow-up survey in 2021 with some of the people from the 2021 survey, where we got some 200 responses too. Of course, there's a big caveat with all this information. It's only about Austin, and it's only for these 2 years. So we cannot generalize this too much into like, what do people think about the police, of course. So first, it might be interesting to take a quick look at like what the overall results in 2020 looked like. The most eye-catching part is really that there was 91% of the respondents supported the reduction, some reduction of the police budget, and like 60% of the people supported more than 3% of reduction. That was a big shift, and it was way more than what people would have expected probably. And these budgets were mostly redistributed to like healthcare and to housing topics. We also saw some other responses, but I won't go, in the interest of time, I won't go too much into detail into those sections. What we do see is that after the exogenous shock, as you can see here, there's a table with some demographic data, and there's a table with like really some responses. As you can see, is as we saw, there was not that much shift actually in the racial ethnic demographics, which is something that naively you may expect given the topic of what was happening at the time. What we did see, there was a huge skew towards younger and people that are more likely to rent their houses, which was actually the opposite of the kind of people that would respond before the shock. What we also saw is that the people supporting to decrease the police budget jumped from 43% to 93%. So there was a clear shift in like how people were responding to that specific part of the question. But we also saw that other parts of the survey really shifted. So for example, in the service fees, we saw that there was much lower support to actually increase those fees. What we also noticed is that in segment 3, so if we go back to the timeline, you see like these two dotted lines. So before the dotted line, before there is this exogenous shock, that's segment 1. Between the dotted lines is segment 2. And after the last dotted line, that's segment 3, when the response rates return a little bit more to like normal levels. So in segment 3, we see that all these numbers bounce back a little bit to what we saw in segment 1, but there's still a strong shift compared, like if you would just compare them one-to-one. Based on this data, it's not immediately clear whether this is because of an actual change in opinion in the population, or whether there was actually just a differential turnout, like a different group of people that is turning out in much higher numbers than before. After the 2020 exercise, we created a knapsack aggregate, we created a report for the city, and we published that. And actually, the city proposed to the city council a budget reduction of the police for 2.5%. The city council actually pushed back on that. They wanted more, and they ended up with a much larger change, which is going to be interesting if we're talking about 2021. But this is what the aggregated budget would look like from all the responses that we received. Now, in 2021, we have this new status quo where the police is already quite a bit smaller than in 2020. There's a safety budget. There's already quite a few changes. And what we see in this response is that if we look at the police data, is that the opinions in the safety budget are actually quite balanced. It's not exactly the same, but that means that even though there was already a strong reduction in the police budget, there was still like a good number of people that wanted to reduce it even further. And there was some people who wanted to bring it back to the old levels, or at least in that direction. Now, we wanted to understand better what exactly happened in this shock period. And for that, we first looked at like demographic data, like how did different demographic groups respond? And that gave us not much information, actually. If you look at white respondents, they were actually more likely to support reduction of police budget than black respondents. There could be all kinds of causes behind this, but that basically meant that slicing it into like demographic groups is not going to bring you much. If you correct for demographic backgrounds, even if you correct it for like age, you would still get strong shifts, even if all these numbers in these different segments were corrected for that. What we did notice is that if we just do k-means clustering for 3 clusters on this data, we get actually quite meaningful insights. We get 3 different profiles of 3 different groups of respondents that make some sense in the real world. The centroids of these clusters, which you see here with a 95% confidence interval, if you resample and recluster, they're quite robust. And if you do the same thing with 2021 data, you see some parallels. In the interest of time, I won't go too much into detail, but you'll be able to read more about that in our paper. The other thing that we really noticed is that if you look at like how these ratios between the different clusters change over time, that you see that before the shock, there's really one of the cluster of responses that is really dominating, and one of the clusters that was barely there at all. So cluster 0, which is the red one, which is the group of people that were strongly in favor of reducing police funding, but they were not in favor of increasing any of the service fees. Those people were barely there at all, and they only started to appear much later in the survey when the exogenous shock happened. The people who were most in support of increasing police funding or decreasing it with a little bit, those were the people that were dominating the responses before. So given everything that we know, that kind of makes sense, but this really gives you some interesting insights into like what happened during that shock. Now, in this follow-up survey, we really looked at like 3 different questions that we asked participants in addition to everything else. So first, we presented people with 3 different scenarios that we got based on aggregated data. And we asked them to choose between the three scenarios and which one of those they preferred. We learned that actually the cluster that they were in the 2021 survey was quite predictive for which of these 3 scenarios they preferred. We also noticed that the scenario that they chose was actually consistent with the scenario that is with their actual cluster profile. So the nice thing about that is that it actually means that there is there's some meaning to these clusters, and they're persistent. The second thing is we asked people, given all these current changes that the city made between 2020 and 2021, how much do they agree with those changes? Do they think that they did not go far enough, that it was right the amount of way, that they went in entirely the wrong direction, or should the city have gone much further? Again, the cluster that people belong to was quite predictive with regards to their responses. And again, their responses were consistent with the cluster opinions. And finally, we asked people to what extent their view of the ideal size of the police force changed over the last 2 years. The correlation between this question and the previous question of like how much do they agree with the current changes was quite strong. So that means that people who thought that the ideal police force actually got smaller in their view over the past 2 years. So 2 years ago, they thought there should be more police than they currently think. Those were also the people that were strongly in agreement with the measures taken by the city, or they thought that the city should have gone further, which actually is an indication that the opinion gap might be widening among these people. So if we take this all together, we see that there are actually a few pieces of evidence that really give some clear indication that there would have been an actual opinion change rather than a differential turnout. So we see that if we demographically reweight the responses from these different segments, we still see a strong shift. So we cannot blame it on demographics. We cannot say like, oh yeah, young people showed up and they saved the day. That's not what happened here. What we also noted is that if we cluster these opinions and we look at this multi-dimensional opinion, then there's actually a strong rise of one specific cluster among all the respondents after the shock. That means that either there was a huge shift in differential turnout, or there was actually some people that were actually changing their opinions or were more able to express them. Thirdly, while the demographics in 2021 were very similar to the demographics before the shock, so they were mostly, again, they were older people, homeowners, because it was a year later after all, the opinion was still much more in favor of police budget reduction than was the case before the shock. So we see also there, we see a pretty big shift. And finally, in the follow-up survey, a lot of people actually indicated to have changed their opinion on the ideal size of the police force over the past 2 years. So that's like this, the self-identified, I changed my opinion. There are a few other conclusions that we can draw from this exercise, which is that we can find clear and robust clusters, which can really help you to identify what happened in a survey like this. In this case, we know what happened. We know that the spike was caused by this specific exogenous shock, but you can imagine in a lot of other surveys that might not be the case. It might still be interesting to actually run clustering and just look at the data from that lens and really try to understand like what is going on here. Secondly, these clusters also captured persistent opinions, which means that these clusters are not just capturing noise, they're really capturing something that is meaningful. And thirdly, we learned that the opinion gap seems to be widening, which is very much in line with what we see in the media, what we see in like daily life. People are actually forming their opinions and getting stronger in them. That doesn't mean that everyone is getting more in favor of police reduction. That also means that people who are in favor of increasing the police size also seem to get stronger in that opinion. And finally, this is really a more general point, like even if there's one dominant, very binary question, do you want to increase or decrease the police size? We find very substantive and useful information if you ask them a much broader question, if you get like more multidimensional question survey out there. So even if you think that one question is dominating your survey, it still makes sense to ask the broader question. Now, if we look at these minority opinion clusters, it might be very interesting to use them because you can also use them without access to any demographics. So that might especially be interesting in more like election settings where you cannot always run a demographic survey for privacy reasons. But there are some questions that we really want to look into further in the future, which is like, how can we aggregate these opinion clusters in a more generalizable way? In this way, like we tested a few different cluster sizes, etc. But that is not necessarily something that really scales. So we need to rethink like, how can we look at this data in a way that is actually scales and that is reliable in that sense? Secondly, how can we really use these opinion clusters to aggregate data, for example, in a way that is more robust to turnout? That you are not necessarily trying to correct for like different turnouts from different demographics, because as we've seen, demographics are not always predictable for opinion groups. And so that way we could perhaps use them as an alternative for re-weighting sampling and look at it from a different lens. Thank you very much for your time. We can find the data as well on our website. We publish that as well. The survey too is available, and feel free to contact me with any questions if you don't have the time right now. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was incredible, fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. It was just kind of a general question about the racial demographics of who, I guess the split of who tended to complete it versus like the Houston city, if you happen to have that kind of demographic breakdown off the top of your head.
So I know that there was an underrepresentation of some of the African American population. I think the Asian population actually was a little bit overrepresented after the shock. But you'll be able to find more of these details in the publication. We put that in the appendix.
Hi, that was really fascinating. It was really cool to see the progression through time, as well as like the survey that happened a while after the exogenous shock. Something you touched upon that I wanted to ask more about was this idea of what are the different subclusters within the clusters that you saw, in the sense that after the initial period of the shock, when you did the follow-up survey, I'm assuming that the opinions of the people would also be aligned with whatever the follow-up police reforms have been suggested by different people within media, within government, within activism, and so on. If you plan to, or if you see any alignment between these policy reforms and people's opinions on what needs to change. And
yes, I think some of that we capture in the follow-up survey by like, how did your question change over the years? We also asked them one or two open-ended questions. So like, what caused your change? We haven't done a ton of analysis on that, especially because like 37,000 responses is hard to analyze. But an initial look into that data didn't give like a very clear picture. Like a lot of people, of course, were responding. Like there's a lot of societal unrest. There's a lot of police misbehavior happening, and we're basically responding to that. I didn't get the impression that there were specific political actors that people were aligning themselves with. But this, I have to take this with like some caution, because it's not something that we analyzed as much in depth as the quantitative data.
thank you.
One more question while the next speaker is setting up.
Hi. My question relates to the previous one and your answer about more sociological factors that could have contributed to something like this. I was wondering if you thought a little bit or you could tell us a little bit more about the definition of this event as an exogenous shock in the first place, and how that relates to the demographic clusters and their opinions over time. Because the killing of George Floyd may not have necessarily been an exogenous shock for certain clusters of the demographic, and the Black Lives Matter movement was also something that was building over time since 2012 with the killing of Trayvon Martin. So could that still be considered an exogenous shock, and how would that, impact the opinion of people over time?
Yeah, good question. Of course, people experience this as like something really core to their lives. And in that sense, you're totally right. From the perspective of the city budget, or from the perspective of a budget survey, that's where it's exogenous, and that's where it's really a shock, because it happened so suddenly. And even though the effects of that were happening over time for a long time, like it was something that a lot of people perhaps saw coming, the outrage and was perhaps reinforced by the fact that everyone was quarantined and this pandemic was going on, did definitely make more of the news, definitely was more in the spotlight, and maybe reached a broader population than was previously the case. But this is really more speculation, but that's also what other literature seems to suggest, that this particular killing had a much bigger effect on the American population than any other event in the past 5 or 10 years. On like emotions, on like outrage, on like different kind of factors. You can see that in the various publications and literature. Okay, thank you.
Great, everyone. Let's thank Lodewijk again.